Good evening, guys, and welcome back to Sleep into Power. I am NJ, and wherever you are in the world tonight, whether it is late in the evening in Birmingham or Edinburgh, the small quiet hours in Nashville or Vancouver, or the very early morning in Brisbane or Christchurch, I am glad you are here. Perhaps you are already lying down, the lights low, the day finally behind you. Perhaps the house has gone still around you, and this is the first truly peaceful moment you have had since you woke. However you have arrived here, you are welcome, and you can let everything else wait until morning. Tonight's documentary was requested more times than almost any other topic in the history of this channel, and a special thank you goes to the subscriber who first suggested it in the comments many months ago. This one is for you, and for everyone who added their voice afterwards. Tonight we are going to travel through the entire history of money, from a time before money existed at all, through clay tablets and golden coins, through silk caravans and Renaissance banking houses, all the way to the glowing screens of the present day, and a little way beyond. Before we begin, a few gentle housekeeping notes. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys through history, you can support the channel by picking up the Sleep into Power book, available now on Amazon in both paperback and Kindle. If you prefer to listen rather than watch, Sleep into Power is also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so you can take these documentaries with you wherever the night finds you. And if you would like to help fund future documentaries and keep this channel growing, you can leave a small donation through Buy Me a Coffee. All of the links are in the video description below. None of it is ever required. Your company here, night after night, is more than enough. So now, get comfortable. Adjust the pillow, pull the blanket a little higher. Let your shoulders soften and your breathing slow. You do not need to remember anything you hear tonight. You do not need to stay awake for the ending. If sleep takes you somewhere in ancient Mesopotamia, or halfway along the Silk Road, that is exactly as it should be. Close your eyes and come with me, far back, to a world without money. It is perhaps 20,000 years ago. Somewhere in a river valley, a small band of people moves through the grass in the late golden light of afternoon. They are hunter-gatherers, as all human beings once were. They own almost nothing, because they carry everything. A few tools of flint and bone, a skin of water, the knowledge, held in memory, of where the berries ripen and where the deer come down to drink. In this world there is no money, and there is no need for it. When a hunter brings back more meat than his family can eat, he does not sell the surplus. He gives it away. He gives it to the old woman who mended his clothing last winter, to the family whose fire he shared during the rains, to the young man who will one day hunt beside him. Nothing is written down, nothing is counted, and yet everyone remembers. Anthropologists call this a gift economy, and it is one of the oldest economic systems on Earth. Its currency, if we can even use that word, is trust. To give generously is to be wealthy in the only way that matters, because generosity binds people to one another. The gift creates a gentle obligation, a warm thread of reciprocity, stretching from one person to the next, from one season to the next. Over thousands of years, those threads wove the first human communities together. Long before anyone invented coins, human beings had already invented the thing that money would one day represent. They had invented cooperation. As groups grew larger and began to meet strangers, something new became necessary. You can rely on memory and kinship among 50 people who have known each other since birth. You cannot rely on them with a traveling stranger you may never see again. And so trade began, quietly, at the edges of the known world. Shells from the coast found their way hundreds of miles inland. Obsidian, the black volcanic glass that holds the sharpest edge, traveled from a handful of mountains across entire continents, passed from hand to hand, camp to camp, generation to generation. Much of this early exchange worked through barter, one useful thing swapped directly for another. Some of it, though, worked through something far stranger and more beautiful, and one example survived long enough for modern eyes to witness it. Among the islands off New Guinea, anthropologists in the early 20th century documented a great ceremonial exchange the islanders called the Kula. Men would sail immense distances in open canoes, across genuinely dangerous water, to trade two kinds of treasured ornament with partners on other islands: necklaces of red shell traveling forever in one direction around the ring of islands, armbands of white shell traveling forever in the other. The ornaments had no practical use at all, and no one kept them for long. Each was held for a time, its history and its previous holders remembered and recited, and then passed onward. And the greatest prestige belonged not to those who accumulated the treasures, but to those through whose hands the finest pieces had traveled. Around this circulating current of gifts, ordinary trade in food, pots and tools traveled too, carried in the same canoes, made safe by the same partnerships. The Kula shows us something easy to forget from inside a world of prices. Exchange, for human beings, was never first about the goods. It was about the relationship, the voyage, the name remembered on a distant island. The goods came along afterwards, riding in the hold. Barter itself is a beautiful idea and a deeply inconvenient one, and its inconvenience quietly shaped everything that came afterwards. For barter to work, each person must want exactly what the other person has, at exactly the same moment. Economists call this the double coincidence of wants. If you have grain and want a goat, you must find someone who has a goat and wants grain, today, in the same place, in quantities that feel fair to you both. Multiply that problem across every good a community needs, and you can feel how heavy it becomes, like trying to carry water in your hands. So people began, almost without noticing, to reach for in between things, goods that nearly everyone would accept, not because they wanted them, but because they knew someone else would. Salt in some places, cattle in others, polished shells, bolts of cloth, bars of metal. These were the first faint shadows of money, cast long before money itself arrived. And as villages became towns, and towns began to dream of becoming cities, the need for something better grew and grew, as slowly and as surely as the wheat ripening in the first cultivated fields. Let that image rest with you for a moment. Firelight, grain in the husk, a handful of shells passed between strangers who are learning, very slowly, to trust one another. This is where our story begins. And if your eyes are already growing heavy, let them close. The story will carry on, gently, without any effort from you at all. Travel forward now, and eastward, to the land the ancient Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Here, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the warm silt of southern Iraq more than 5,000 years ago, human beings built the first true cities the world had ever seen. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Eridu, which its own people believed to be the oldest city on earth. Picture one of them at dusk, mud brick walls glowing amber in the last of the light, the smell of river water and baking bread, narrow lanes crowded with potters, weavers, fishermen, priests, and rising above everything, a stepped temple platform, a ziggurat, climbing towards the first pale stars. The temple was not only a house of the gods, it was, in a very real sense, the first bank, the first granary, the first accounting office. Into the temple flowed the harvests of the surrounding fields, offerings of barley, wool, dates and oil. Out of the temple flowed rations for workers, seed for the next planting, provisions for widows and orphans. Somebody had to keep track of all of it. And it was here, in the storerooms of these temples, that one of the greatest inventions in human history quietly took place. At first, the temple administrators used small clay tokens, little cones and spheres and discs, each shape standing for a quantity of goods. A cone might mean a small measure of barley, a sphere a larger one. In time, they began sealing these tokens inside hollow clay envelopes, and then pressing the shapes of the tokens into the soft outside of the envelope, so the contents could be read without breaking it open. And then one day, someone realized something wonderfully simple. If the marks on the outside told you everything, you did not need the tokens inside at all. You only needed the marks. From that realization came writing itself. The earliest cuneiform tablets, pressed with a cut reed into damp clay and dried in the Mesopotamian sun, are not poems or prayers. They are receipts, lists of grain, deliveries of wool, counts of sheep and cattle. Humanity learned to write, not to tell stories, but to keep accounts. Every word you have ever read, including the ones drifting past you now, descends from a farmer's ledger. With record-keeping came something else, something that has never left us: debt. The tablets record loans of barley and silver, to be repaid at harvest, often with interest. They record wages owed and taxes due. A farmer might borrow seed grain in spring against the promise of the autumn crop, and the promise itself, pressed into clay, became a kind of value that could be held, stored, and even passed to another person. Money, at its deepest root, was never really a thing. It was a promise, given a shape, and gradually, one substance rose above the others as the common measure of all this promising: silver. It did not rot like grain or sicken like cattle. It could be divided, weighed, melted, and combined without losing its worth. In Mesopotamia, silver was rarely coined and often barely even seen. It was weighed out in units called shekels, and much of the time it simply sat in temple treasuries while people traded against it, using it as a ruler for value, the way we use meters for distance. A jar of oil was worth so many shekels of silver, so was a month of labor, or a field, or a fine woolen cloak. For the first time, utterly different things could be measured against a single, shared standard. The great law codes of the region, the most famous of them issued by King Hammurabi of Babylon around 1750 BC, are full of these silver valuations, setting prices, wages, fines, and the rules of lending. Justice itself was being weighed in shekels. Civilization was learning its arithmetic. Even the idea of interest, so familiar to us, seems to have been born here, and born from the fields themselves. Loans in the ancient Near East were often loans of living things, of grain that would sprout, of herds that would calve, and it was natural that a lender should receive back not only what was lent, but a share of the increase. In the Sumerian language, the word for interest was related to the word for a young animal, as if repayment naturally came with offspring. Where debts grew too heavy, kings would sometimes proclaim a general cancellation, a clean slate, wiping away the burdens of the poor at the start of a rain, restoring balance the way the flooding rivers restored the fields. The rhythm of borrowing, straining, and forgiving is as old as civilization itself, and none of it would have worked without the scribes. In the tablet houses of the Mesopotamian cities, boys, and occasionally girls, sat cross-legged through long, hot days, pressing their reeds into practice tablets, copying lists of words, weights, and measures, learning the multiplication tables and the compound interest problems that survive to this day as some of the world's oldest homework. To be a scribe was to hold a key to the whole machinery of civilization, and their proverbs say so with a smile. The scribal art, one tablet declares, is the mother of orators and the father of scholars. When those students bent over their clay in the afternoon heat, 4,000 years ago, they were the distant ancestors of every accountant, banker, and clerk who has ever balanced a book, and of every tired student who has ever fallen asleep over their sums. Some things, across all the centuries, have not changed in the slightest. The shekel itself, that Mesopotamian unit of weighed silver, has proved one of the most durable words in human history. It passed from Sumer and Akkad into the languages of the whole region. It appears throughout the Hebrew scriptures, and it lives on today as the currency of a modern nation, a word spoken at market stalls this very evening that was spoken at market stalls 5,000 years ago. Money forgets nothing, it only folds its memories away, like linen in a chest, layer upon layer, age upon age. So as you lie there, letting your breathing settle into its own slow rhythm, hold this gentle thought. In the beginning, money was not gold in a vault. It was a mark in wet clay, a promise between neighbors, a measure agreed by a whole city so that strangers could deal fairly with one another. Trust made visible. And the rivers ran on past the temple walls, as they still do, carrying the light of the evening away towards the sea. Drift westward now, across deserts and centuries, to the valley of the Nile. If Mesopotamia invented the ledger, Egypt perfected the granary. For 3,000 years, longer than the distance separating us from the pharaohs themselves, Egyptian civilization endured beside its river, and it did so, remarkably, almost entirely without money as we would recognize it. Each summer the Nile rose, spreading dark, fertile silt across the fields, and each autumn the waters withdrew and the planting began. The Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the river, and the whole economy of the kingdom moved to the river's patient rhythm. Wealth in Egypt was not silver, it was grain. Emmer wheat for bread, barley for beer, measured in heaps and sacks and standard jars, flowing from the fields into a vast network of state and temple granaries, the way the floodwaters flowed across the land. The state stood at the center of everything. Scribes, those patient men with their reed pens and pots of black and red ink, measured the fields after each flood, estimated the harvest, and assessed the taxes, which were paid not in coin, but in produce and in labor. A farmer gave a portion of his wheat. A fisherman gave a portion of his catch. And in the season when the fields lay under water and there was no farming to be done, ordinary Egyptians gave their labor to the state, hauling stone, digging canals, raising the temples and, yes, building the pyramids. The evidence we have suggests the pyramid builders were not the slaves of legend, but organized, rationed, rotating crews of workers, paid in bread, beer, onions and cloth, housed in purpose-built villages, and proud enough of their work to leave their team names painted inside the monuments. Gangs with names like the Friends of Khufu. Payment in Egypt, then, was payment in kind, but it was not vague or casual. Rations were calculated with great precision. Workers at the royal tomb builders' village of Deir el-Medina received measured amounts of grain each month, senior craftsmen more than juniors, and the amounts were recorded, disputed, and sometimes, when the deliveries ran late in the troubled years of the late New Kingdom, protested. Written records from the reign of Ramesses III, around 1150 BC, describe tomb workers laying down their tools when their grain rations failed to arrive, an event often described as the first recorded labor strike in human history. Even without coins, Egyptians knew perfectly well how to compare values. Documents from the marketplace show goods being priced against common measures: sacks of grain, weights of copper called deben, jars of oil. A goat might be reckoned at so many deben of copper and paid for with a bed, some cloth, and a quantity of grain, adding up to the same figure. Value existed as a shared idea, hovering above the goods themselves, exactly as it does today, when numbers move between bank accounts without a single note changing hands. Stroll through one of those riverside markets for a moment, in the cool of the morning before the heat settles in. Boats nose against the bank, unloading fish, pots, and bundles of papyrus. Along the shore, traders sit behind their goods, and tomb paintings show us the scene almost as if we stood there, a woman offering vegetables, a man weighing copper on a balance, a sailor trading a portion of his grain ration for something sweeter. Everything is negotiation, but negotiation with a shared measure humming quietly underneath. So many deben of copper, so many sacks of emmer, and the scribe's notes on flakes of limestone and broken pottery, called ostraca, record thousands of these small bargains, sandals and beds and donkeys and coffins, each priced, each remembered. Ordinary Egyptians never handled money, and yet they calculated value every single day of their lives, fluently, the way we hum a tune without reading the notes. And though Egypt had no coins, it had something the whole ancient world dreamed about: gold. From the deserts and from Nubia to the south came gold in quantities that made Egypt legendary among its neighbors. Gold for temple doors and burial masks, for the throne and the gods. In the diplomatic letters found at Amarna, written in the 14th century BC, between the pharaoh and the kings of the Near East, foreign rulers ask for Egyptian gold again and again, and one king of Mitanni writes, in a phrase that has echoed down the centuries, that in Egypt, gold is as plentiful as dust. Gold flowed outward as royal gifts, sealing alliances and marriages, an economy of splendor conducted entirely between palaces, while the villages below lived on grain and barter. When the young pharaoh Tutankhamun was buried, a king of little power and a short reign, his innermost coffin alone was made from well over 100 kilograms of solid gold, and it lay unseen in the dark for 3,200 years, patient as only gold can be, until the morning in 1922 when light touched it again. Wealth in Egypt was never really for the living. It was a message sent to eternity, and presiding over it all was an ideal the Egyptians called Maat, meaning truth, balance, right order. The pharaoh's duty was to uphold Maat, to keep the granaries full and the scales honest, so that in years of bad flood, the stores of good years could feed the hungry. Wealth, in the Egyptian imagination, was not private treasure. It was stored sunlight, stored river water, stored labor, held in trust against the uncertain turning of the seasons. Let your thoughts float down that river for a while. The creak of a wooden water lifter, the rustle of ripe wheat, white ibis wading in the shallows as the evening cools. A civilization kept itself alive for 30 centuries on grain, patience, and careful records, and it teaches us something worth carrying into sleep. Money has never really been the thing itself. The thing itself is bread, shelter, safety, and time. Money is only ever a way of remembering who has shared them, and who has promised what to whom. Breathe slowly now, and let the river carry you on towards the east, where something small, round, and bright is waiting to be invented. Far to the east, along the valley of the Yellow River, another great civilization was solving the same problems in its own way. In the Bronze Age kingdoms of ancient China, among the earliest forms of wealth we can trace were cowrie shells. Small, smooth, gleaming shells gathered from warm southern seas and carried enormous distances inland. Their pale, polished surfaces caught the light like porcelain. They were durable, difficult to counterfeit, easy to count, and pleasing to hold. And they became so deeply woven into Chinese ideas of value that the written character for shell still appears, thousands of years later, inside Chinese characters relating to money, wealth, buying, selling, and treasure. The language itself remembers. As bronze working flourished, the Chinese began to cast imitation cowries in metal, and then something stranger and rather beautiful. Money in the shape of tools, small bronze spades, flat and stylized, descendants of the real farming spades that had once been bartered. Small bronze knives, thin and curved, with a ring at the end of the handle so they could be strung together. Spade money and knife money circulated for centuries across the warring states of ancient China, value cast in the shape of usefulness, as if the memory of barter had been poured directly into the metal. In time, these gave way to round bronze coins with a square hole at the center, threaded by the hundreds onto cords, and that simple, practical design endured in China for some 2,000 years. But China's greatest monetary invention was still to come, and it was made not of metal at all, but of paper. During the Tang dynasty, in the 9th century, merchants moving goods across vast distances grew weary of hauling wagon loads of heavy bronze coins, and a system arose that came to be called flying money. A merchant could deposit his coins in the capital, receive a paper certificate, and redeem it far away in the provinces, the value flying across the empire while the metal stayed safely at rest. These certificates were receipts rather than true currency, but the idea had been planted. Then, under the Song dynasty, in the province of Sichuan around the beginning of the 11th century, merchants began issuing standardized paper notes called jiaozi, which could pass from hand to hand like money itself, and in the year 1024, the Song government took over their issue, printing official notes backed by reserves of coin. It was the first true government paper money in the history of the world, centuries before anything comparable appeared in Europe. When European travelers such as Marco Polo later described an emperor who could, as it seemed to them, turn paper into silver by decree, readers back home struggled to believe such a thing was possible. Value, the Chinese had discovered, did not need to live inside the object at all. It could live entirely in shared belief, so long as the belief was carefully maintained. That final condition, carefully maintained, carried the whole weight of the experiment, and China learned its importance the hard way, centuries before Europe would. Under the Mongol Yuan dynasty in the 13th century, Kublai Khan made paper the very foundation of his realm, decreeing that his notes must be accepted throughout the empire, and for a time, the system worked magnificently, astonishing every foreign visitor who saw it. But paper money places a temptation in a ruler's hands that metal never quite does. For a mint is slow, and a printing block is fast. When wars and court expenses swelled beyond the treasury, the Yuan and the dynasties that followed printed more, and then more again, and the value of the notes crumbled as the quantity grew, prices climbing as confidence drained away. By the middle of the Ming dynasty, China, the inventor of paper money, had largely set it aside, returning to weighed silver for serious transactions, and paper would not truly rule there again for centuries. It is one of history's quietest and most important lessons, learned first in the East and relearned many times since. Paper can carry value across an empire more lightly than any metal, but only for as long as those who print it can resist the printing press. Belief is a harvest, and it can be exhausted like any field. Southward now, across the mountains, to the Indian subcontinent, where by the middle of the first millennium BC, the towns of the Gangetic Plain were filling with merchants, caravans, and busy river ports. Here appeared one of the world's earliest coinages, the punch-marked coins of ancient India, small flat pieces of silver, cut to a standard weight and stamped, one symbol at a time, with tiny punched marks. Suns, hills, trees, animals, wheels, each mark pressed separately into the metal, sometimes half a dozen on a single coin, guaranteeing its weight and purity to everyone who received it. These little pieces of silver lubricated a vast and sophisticated commercial world, and Indian texts of the age discuss trade, taxation, interest and state finance with striking care and subtlety. Long-distance commerce flowed along the rivers and out across the sea, towards Arabia in one direction and Southeast Asia in the other, and wealth moved with it, pressed into silver, marked with symbols, passed from palm to palm. Notice as you rest there how the same idea kept surfacing in place after place, unconnected, unplanned. A shell, a spade of bronze, a punched piece of silver, a printed slip of paper. Different materials, one single human insight. If we can all agree on what a thing is worth, the thing itself hardly matters. Agreement is the treasure. Everything else is just what we write it on. Come back westward now, gently, to the sunlit hills of western Anatolia, in what is today Turkey. Here, in the small, prosperous kingdom of Lydia, in the decades around 600 BC, an invention appeared that would outlast empires: the coin. The river that ran through the Lydian capital of Sardis carried something unusual in its sands. Electrum, a natural blend of gold and silver, pale yellow and softly gleaming. For a long time, People had traded lumps of precious metal by weight, which meant every transaction required scales, weights, and a wary squint. Then, in Lydia, someone had the idea of stamping small pieces of electrum of a fixed weight with an official mark, the roaring head of a lion, the badge of the royal house. The stamp was a promise. It said, "You do not need to weigh this. You do not need to test it." The king himself stands behind it. The earliest of these stamped pieces date from the late 7th century BC, and with them, something subtle and profound happened. Trust, which had once lived in temples, in ledgers, in personal reputation, was pressed directly into metal and set loose to wander. A coin could travel where its maker had never been, and still be believed. A few generations later, Lydia's most famous king refined the idea further. Croesus, whose name became a byword for wealth itself, so that people still say rich as Croesus, 2,500 years after his death. His metallurgists learned to separate electrum into pure gold and pure silver, and around the middle of the 6th century BC, Croesus issued matched coinages in both metals, with fixed values against one another. The world's first bimetallic currency system, gold for great affairs, silver for the market square. When the Persians conquered Lydia in 546 BC, they did not abolish this marvelous machine. They adopted it and carried the idea of coinage across the largest empire the world had yet seen. But it was the Greeks, just across the water, who fell truly in love with the coin. City after city began striking its own, and because each city stamped its coins with its own emblem, the owl of Athens, the turtle of Aegina, the ear of barley of Metapontum, coins became tiny ambassadors, carrying the pride of their cities into every port of the Mediterranean. In the agora, the open marketplace at the heart of every Greek city, coinage helped create something remarkably modern, a public space where strangers could meet as equals, haggle, trade, and walk away satisfied, with no need for kinship or priesthood to stand between them. No city embraced the new invention more completely than Athens. In the hills of Laurion, a day's walk from the city, lay rich veins of silver bearing ore, and the mines of Laurion became the quiet engine of Athenian greatness. From that silver, the city struck its famous coinage, stamped with the helmeted head of the goddess Athena on one side and her sacred owl on the other, wide-eyed, solemn, and instantly recognizable. The Athenians deliberately kept the design almost unchanged for generations, even as artistic fashions moved on, because familiarity itself was the point. Merchants from Sicily to Egypt knew the owls, trusted the owls, and asked for them by name. The owl of Athens became the first truly international currency of the Mediterranean world, accepted far beyond any place Athenian law could reach. And when the citizens of Athens debated how to spend a newly discovered seam of silver in 483 BC, they chose, at the urging of the statesman Themistocles, to build a fleet of warships. The ships they bought with Laurion silver would, within a few years, help save Greece itself at the Battle of Salamis. Money, for the first time we can watch closely, was shaping the fate of nations. The everyday coin of Greek life was the drachma, divided into 6 slender obols, and the coins reached into every corner of existence, and even a little beyond it. Jurors in the Athenian courts were paid their obols for a day's service, which allowed ordinary men, not only the wealthy, to take part in the life of the city. Workers on the temples of the Acropolis were paid a drachma a day, mason and master sculptor alike, according to the surviving building accounts. And when a Greek died, the family would sometimes place a small coin in the grave, payment for Charon, the silent ferryman who rowed souls across the dark river to the world below. Even the afterlife, the Greeks gently assumed, would have its fares. There is something touching in that custom, a coin resting quietly for a journey no living person could describe. Trust extended past the very edge of the known. When Alexander of Macedon marched east in the late 4th century BC, he carried the Greek coin with him across Persia and beyond, minting silver by the ton from captured royal treasuries that had lain, until then, as idle bullion in the vaults of kings. Wealth that had slept for generations was stamped, spent, and set moving through the markets of 3 continents. And in the kingdoms his generals left behind, from Egypt to the borders of India, coins bearing Greek letters and Greek profiles became part of daily life. The little Lydian invention had, within 3 centuries, become the common habit of half the world. And because the Greeks could never experience anything without also thinking deeply about it, money itself became a subject of philosophy. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, reflected on how money serves as a medium of exchange, a measure of value and a store of wealth. And he drew a line that people still argue about today. Using money to serve the household and the community, he taught, is natural and good. But pursuing money for its own sake, wealth chasing wealth without limit, he regarded with deep suspicion, and he reserved particular disapproval for charging interest, for money breeding money, which seemed to him a kind of unnatural birth. The Greeks handed us not only the coin, but the conscience that has jingled alongside it ever since. Feel the weight of one of those early coins for a moment, in the darkness behind your closed eyes. Small, thick, surprisingly heavy, the lion's brow worn smooth by 10,000 fingers. Every coin, every note, every number on every screen in the modern world is a descendant of that little piece of stamped metal and of the quiet idea inside it. You can trust this, because we all agree to trust it together. Now the road widens and becomes paved and marches westward towards the greatest monetary machine of the ancient world, Rome. The Romans were not quick to adopt coinage. For centuries the early city measured wealth in cattle and in rough lumps of bronze, and the memory of it never left the language. The Latin word for money, pecunia, comes from pecus, meaning livestock, and our own words salary and fee carry old stories inside them in just the same way. Salt rations and cattle payments echoing quietly inside modern payslips. It was only in the 3rd century BC, as Rome fought its long wars for control of Italy and then of the Western Mediterranean, that a full Roman coinage took shape, and at its heart, for over 4 centuries, stood a small silver coin called the denarius. The denarius paid for everything. It paid the legions above all, for Rome's money was always, first and last, military finance. A soldier of the early empire earned a few hundred denarii a year, and with dozens of legions under arms, plus fleets, roads, aqueducts, temples, and the grain dole that fed the poor of the capital, the emperors needed rivers of silver flowing perpetually inwards. Taxes flowed from every province, assessed by censuses of people and land, gathered in coin and in grain, counted, recorded, and spent. Around this flow grew a genuinely sophisticated financial world. Roman bankers, the argentari, changed money, held deposits, made loans, and settled debts between clients by adjusting their books rather than moving sacks of coins. Wealthy Romans bought and sold estates across the sea by letters and ledgers. Cicero himself remarks on transferring funds between Rome and Athens through bankers' paper rather than shipping the actual silver. For 2 centuries of relative peace, this system knitted together some 50 million people, from the moors of Britain to the sands of Syria, into a single vast market. The same coins, bearing the emperor's face, passed through a fishmonger's hands in Alexandria and a wine merchant's in Gaul. Prices, wages, rents, and dowries were reckoned in a common currency across 3 continents. Nothing like it would be seen again in Europe for well over 1,000 years. Walk through a Roman street market for a moment, in the cool of the early morning, and you can watch the system breathing. Bakers slide loaves from their ovens, and the walls of Pompeii, preserved in ash, still carry painted price lists and election slogans, and the graffiti of ordinary people talking about wages, bargains, and debts. A loaf of bread for a couple of small bronze coins, a jug of ordinary wine for a little more. In the Forum, moneylenders' stalls stand in the shade of the colonnade, and porters carry strongboxes bound in iron. The empire's poor in the capital receive distributions of grain from the state, the famous bread that accompanied the circuses, while the wealthy moved sums through their bankers that could buy whole provinces' worth of land. Between them stretched every gradation of fortune: freedmen who built trading empires, soldiers saving for retirement, shopkeepers with their savings buried in a pot beneath the floor. When Vesuvius buried Pompeii in the year 79, it preserved, along with the bread still in the ovens, the coins in 1,000 purses, the small change of daily Roman life, waiting where their owners dropped them. A whole economy stopped mid-heartbeat and kept for us to see. And yet, inside the silver, a slow illness was at work. Empires are expensive, and Roman emperors, pressed by wars, plagues, and the endless payroll of the legions, discovered the oldest and most tempting trick available to any ruler who controls the mint. If you melt down 1,000 old coins, add copper to the silver, and strike 1,100 new coins of the same face value, you have conjured money from nothing. For a while, no one notices. The coins look the same, but the trick, once learned, is very hard to unlearn. Under Nero, the denarius was still mostly fine silver. By the early 3rd century, its purity had fallen substantially. And as crisis followed crisis through that terrible century, soldier emperors rising and falling almost yearly, the coinage collapsed into little more than silver-washed bronze. People are not fools, and they never have been. Good coins vanished into hoards, buried in fields and floorboards, where archaeologists still find them today. Prices climbed as trust drained away. The Emperor Diocletian, around the year 301, tried to command the tide to stop, issuing his famous edict on maximum prices, fixing the lawful cost of goods across the empire on pain of death. It failed, as price edicts generally do, because an empire can stamp its will on metal, but not on belief. Rome did not fall because of its money alone, but the long sickness of the denarius teaches a lesson that has never once been repeated without coming true. Money is a promise, and a promise diluted is a promise weakened. Every ruler since who has quietly expanded the money supply to pay for what taxes could not cover has been walking a road the Romans paved. Let the legions march away into the dusk now, their bootsteps fading like a slowing heartbeat. The Forum empties. Somewhere a shopkeeper counts his takings by lamplight, bites a suspicious coin, shrugs, and drops it in the box. The empire is vast, the night is warm, and the roads run on into the darkness, towards the east, where the silk caravans are loading by torchlight. Follow them slowly. There is no hurry at all. Close your eyes a little more deeply now, and listen. Camel bells, somewhere ahead in the darkness, the soft shuffle of laden animals on stone and sand. We have joined a caravan on the network of routes that later historians would call the Silk Road, though the people who traveled it knew it only as the road, the way east, the way west. It was never a single road. It was a braid of tracks and passes, oasis towns and caravanserais, stretching some 4,000 miles from the old Chinese capital of Chang'an, through the deserts and mountain corridors of Central Asia, down into Persia, and on towards the Mediterranean, with branches running south to India and sea routes swinging wide around the coasts. Along it, for well over 1,000 years, moved the most precious portable goods on earth, Chinese silk above all, so light that a fortune could be folded into a saddlebag, so desired that Roman moralists complained about the empire's silver draining eastward to pay for it. Spices from India and the islands beyond, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, worth many times their weight in silver by the time they reached a European table. Glass and coral traveling east, jade, furs, horses, paper, and gold and silver moving in every direction, settling the balances between civilizations that would never see one another face to face. Almost no one traveled the whole road. Goods moved like water passed along a line of hands, traded from merchant to merchant at each oasis, each exchange adding a margin, each margin adding to the price. A bolt of silk might change owners a dozen times between a workshop in China and a market stall in Damascus. And precisely because the road crossed so many borders, languages and currencies, its merchants became quiet pioneers of financial trust. Letters of credit and early forms of the bill of exchange allowed value to travel safely where carrying treasure was dangerous. Merchant families and communities scattered along the route. Sogdians in the early centuries, later Armenians, Jews, Arabs and others, formed networks in which a promise made in one city would be honored in another, months later and mountains away, because reputation was the most valuable cargo of all, and the caravans carried far more than goods. Buddhism traveled the Silk Road out of India into China, its cave temples still glowing with painted paradises along the desert routes. Islam traveled it. Christianity traveled it. Paper-making traveled westward along it. And so, eventually, did printing, gunpowder, and the compass. Music, stories, styles of dress, fruits and recipes, all moved with the slow rhythm of the caravans. When you exchange goods, you cannot help exchanging worlds. Picture one of the great oasis cities at evening, Samarkand perhaps, blue-domed and golden-walled, rising out of the desert like a promise kept. The caravan comes in through the gates at dusk, 40 camels swaying under their loads, and the caravanserai receives them, a great square courtyard with a well at its center, arcades of shaded bays around the sides, storerooms below, and sleeping quarters above. The animals are unloaded, watered and fed. The merchants wash the dust from their faces and gather as strangers around shared food. And by lamplight the talk begins, in a patchwork of languages, of prices in Kashgar and taxes in Merv, of which passes are snowed in and which princes are honest, of what silk is fetching this season in the West. News itself was a currency on the road, carried and traded as carefully as pepper, and in the morning the caravan moves on, and another arrives, and the well and the walls remain, serving traveler after traveler, century after century, one of the most patient forms of hospitality civilization has ever devised. The road had its golden ages and its dark ones, and its greatest flowering came, strangely, under the most feared conquerors of the medieval world. When the Mongol Empire of the 13th century united the whole span of the route under a single power, the roads became safer than they had ever been, and travelers reported that a merchant could cross Asia unarmed and unrobbed. It was in these years that Marco Polo made his famous journey east and returned with tales of paper money and cities beyond counting. Ideas, inventions, and, tragically, diseases moved along the open road together, for the same caravans that carried silk westward in the 14th century helped carry the plague. Connection has always carried both gifts and risks in the same saddlebags, and the world has never once, in all its history, chosen to be disconnected for long. The pull of exchange is simply too deep in us. It may be one of the deepest things we are. There is something deeply restful in the thought of it. For most of human history, the fastest that wealth could move was the walking pace of a camel, about 3 miles in an hour. Fortunes crossed continents at the speed of a gentle stroll. Let your own thoughts slow to that pace now. Sand, stars, bells, breath. The fires of the caravanserai are burning low, and westward, over the edge of the night, Europe is stirring in its long medieval sleep. When the Western Roman Empire faded in the 5th century, its money faded with it. Coins did not vanish from Europe, but they grew scarce, and in many places life folded inward, back towards the land. This was the world of feudalism, a great pyramid of loyalty and obligation, resting not on money but on soil. A king granted land to his great lords. The lords granted land to knights in exchange for military service, and at the base of everything, the peasants worked the fields, giving their lord days of labor and shares of harvest in exchange for protection and the right to farm. Rents were paid in eggs, in grain, in plowing days. For an ordinary person in the year 800, entire seasons might pass without the touch of a single coin. Yet money never sleeps for long. From the 11th century onwards, Europe began to warm and quicken. New plows and mills, new fields cleared from the forest. More food, more people, and with them, the rebirth of towns. Behind their walls, a new kind of person multiplied, neither lord nor peasant, the burgher, the townsman, the craftsman, the merchant, people who lived not from the land, but from the trade of their hands and their wits, and whose world ran on coin. The craftsmen gathered themselves into guilds, brotherhoods of bakers, weavers, goldsmiths, masons, each guild guarding the standards of its craft, training apprentices, fixing fair prices, caring for members' widows, and marching behind its own banner on feast days. The guilds were economic institutions, but they were also families of trust, and their halls still stand in old European cities, solid and dignified, monuments to the idea that commerce and community could hold hands. Above the weekly town markets rose something grander, the great fairs, and none were greater than the fairs of Champagne, in northeastern France. Through the 12th and 13th centuries, in a cycle of towns, Troyes, Provence, Lagny, Bar-sur-Aube, fairs followed one another around the calendar almost continuously, and merchants came from everywhere. Flemish cloth met Italian silk, English wool met Mediterranean spices, leather from Spain, furs from the north. The counts of Champagne guaranteed safe conduct on the roads, special courts settled disputes swiftly, and for a few golden generations these fairs became the beating commercial heart of Europe. They became something more as well, a school of finance. With a dozen currencies clinking on the tables, money changers were indispensable, seated at their benches with scales and ledgers. The Italian word for bench, banca, would in time give its name to a whole industry. And because carrying chests of silver across bandit-ridden Europe was a fine way to lose both silver and life, merchants revived and refined the bill of exchange. A merchant could pay in one city, in one currency, and his partner could collect in another city, in another currency. Weeks later, the value traveling as ink while the silver stayed home. Debts from one fair could be carried forward to the next, balances offset against balances, so that great streams of trade were settled with only a trickle of actual coin. Europe was quietly teaching itself the arts that Mesopotamian temples and Silk Road merchants had known, that money is at its most powerful when it becomes almost invisible. There is one more group of medieval bankers worth meeting before we cross the Alps, and they are perhaps the most unexpected bankers in all of history. Monks, warrior monks. The Knights Templar were founded in the early 12th century to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, and they grew into a great international order, with fortified houses scattered from London and Paris to the ports of the Mediterranean and the castles of the Crusader East. Pilgrimage posed a financial problem that will sound familiar by now. A pilgrim needed money for a journey of many months, across dangerous roads, and carrying it invited robbery. The Templars offered an elegant solution. A traveler could deposit funds at a Templar house in his own country and receive a document, and on presenting it at Templar houses along the way, he could draw out what he needed, the order settling the balances internally across its network. It was, in effect, an early traveler's check, backed not by a king, but by the discipline and reach of a religious order whose houses stretched across Christendom. In time, the Templars kept treasuries for monarchs, moved funds for popes, and made loans to crowned heads, and their Paris temple became one of the great financial centers of Europe. Their story ended darkly in the early 14th century, when a French king deeply in their debt moved against them, but the lesson of their rise remained. Wherever there is trust with a long reach, banking will grow, whether the bankers wear merchants' robes or monks' mantles. Feel that long, slow thaw as you rest. A continent that had gone quiet, warming again, roads filling, bells over market squares, wagons of wool swaying towards Champagne under a spring sky. And down over the Alps, in the sunlit cities of Italy, men in counting houses are about to turn all of this bustle into an art, and money itself into a kind of intelligence. Come south now, over the mountains, into the city-states of Italy, and settle in Florence, in the 15th century. The city rises in domes and towers of honey-colored stone above the river Arno. Wool and silk workshops hum in the side streets, and on a street called Via Larga stands the palace of a family whose name would become almost a synonym for the power of money: the Medici. Italy stood at the crossroads of everything, between Europe and the Mediterranean, between the fairs of the north and the trade of the east, and its merchants handled money in more currencies and greater volumes than anyone in Christendom. Out of that ferment, in cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa, emerged the recognizable ancestor of the modern bank. These houses took deposits, made loans, traded bills of exchange, and opened branches in foreign cities so that a merchant's credit could travel with him from Florence to Bruges to London. Their essential tool was ink. In the counting houses of Italy, merchants perfected a method of record-keeping so elegant and so reliable that it is still, essentially, how every company on earth keeps its books today: double-entry bookkeeping. Every transaction recorded twice, once as a debit and once as a credit, the two columns forever balancing like the two pans of a scale. At any moment, a merchant could see precisely what he owned, what he owed, and whether he was truly making money or merely feeling busy. When the friar and mathematician Luca Pacioli described the method in print in 1494, he was setting down what Italian merchants had already practiced for generations. It sounds humble, two matching columns of figures, but clear sight is a kind of power, and Europe's merchants could now see further and more truly than ever before. The Medici Bank, founded by Giovanni de' Medici in 1397 and raised to greatness by his son Cosimo, became the most famous financial house of the age. Its branches stretched across Europe, its ledgers tracked wool, silk, alum and bills of exchange, and its most valuable client was the papacy itself, whose revenues flowed through Medici hands. Because openly charging interest was condemned by the medieval church as usury, bankers wove their profit discreetly into the exchange rates of bills drawn between cities, finance and diplomacy, learning to speak in the same polished murmur. And here is the part of the story that still glows. The Medici did not simply hoard their fortune. They spent it, lavishly, deliberately, on beauty. Cosimo and his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent poured banking wealth into libraries, churches, palaces and workshops, into the careers of artists and scholars, Donatello, Botticelli, and a young sculptor named Michelangelo, who was welcomed into the Medici household as a boy. Banking profits, distilled from wool and spice and careful arithmetic, helped pay for a rebirth of art and learning so bright that we still call the whole era by its glow, the Renaissance. It is one of history's gentlest ironies. Some of the most sublime beauty human beings have ever created was underwritten by the tidy balances of a ledger. Florence was not alone. Out on its lagoon, Venice had grown rich as the hinge between Europe and the East, its galleys sailing scheduled convoys to Alexandria and Constantinople, its Rialto Bridge and the markets around it forming one of the great trading floors of the medieval world. In 1284, Venice began striking a gold coin called the ducat, and it kept that coin's weight and purity essentially unchanged for over 500 years, through wars, plagues, and the rise and fall of empires. 5 centuries of a promise kept, without interruption. Merchants across the Mediterranean and far beyond came to trust the ducat as their grandfathers had, and as their grandsons would, and its steadiness became a quiet pillar of world trade. Florence's own gold florin, first struck in 1252, earned the same reputation across Europe. In an age of kings who clipped and debased their coinages whenever war emptied their treasuries, the merchant republics of Italy had discovered a paradoxical secret. The most profitable thing a currency can do is to be boring. Never surprise anyone, decade after decade, and the whole world will beat a path to your harbor. Rest inside one of those counting houses for a moment. Evening light through high windows, the scratch of a quill, the soft click of an abacus, and through the open shutters, from across the rooftops, the sound of a chisel shaping marble. Money, which began as grain in a temple, has learned to keep accounts, cross borders as ink, and commission angels. And out on the western sea, ships are being rigged for voyages that will stretch this whole delicate web around the entire planet. Breathe out slowly. We will board them together, drifting all the way. In the closing years of the 15th century, the ships went out. Portuguese caravels felt their way down the coast of Africa and around the Cape towards the spices of India. Spanish fleets struck westward across the Atlantic, and in the mountains of the lands they conquered, they found silver in quantities the Old World had never imagined. At Potosi, high in the thin, cold air of the Andes, an entire mountain proved to be veined with it, and for the next century and more, treasure fleets carried American silver eastward across the ocean, galleon after galleon, year after year. Potosi deserves a moment of quiet attention, because for a while, it was one of the most extraordinary places on Earth. The mountain rises above 4,000 meters, a reddish cone against a thin blue sky, and beneath the peak, the miners followed the silver down into the dark. Within decades of the discovery, in 1545, a city of astonishing size had gathered at the mountain's foot, by some accounts rivaling the greatest cities of Europe in population, with churches, mints, theaters, and gambling houses standing on a freezing plateau where almost nothing grows. The wealth was real, and so was its cost, for the mines consumed the labor of vast numbers of indigenous workers under a system of compulsory service, and the human price of that silver is part of its history and should be remembered alongside the splendor it brought. In Spanish, the phrase "Huerta Potosí" passed into the language as a way of describing limitless riches, and it appears in the pages of Don Quixote. A mountain had become a synonym for money itself. From the mints of Potosí and Mexico, the silver traveled under guard to the coast, and then in the great convoys of the treasure fleet across the Atlantic to Seville, where the crown's officials weighed, registered, and taxed every bar and coin, the king taking his royal fifth. And here unfolds one of history's most instructive ironies. The Spanish crown, receiving rivers of silver no monarchy had ever dreamed of, still managed to spend faster than the rivers flowed. Endless wars in the Netherlands, Italy, and the Mediterranean, and the upkeep of a global empire, devoured the treasure before it arrived, much of it pledged in advance to the great German and Genoese banking houses, the Fuggers foremost among them, who lent against next year's fleet the way a farmer borrows against next year's harvest. Again and again through the late 16th century, the Spanish crown suspended payment on its debts, and each suspension shook the banking houses of Europe. The richest kingdom in the world was, on paper, repeatedly insolvent, and Europe slowly absorbed a truth that has never stopped being true. Income is not wealth. A fortune flowing through your hands is not the same as a fortune remaining in them, and no quantity of silver can outpace a determination to spend it. Europe had never seen so much money, and Europe learned, slowly and painfully, one of economics' deepest lessons. More money does not mean more wealth. Spanish silver paid for wars, luxuries, and imports, and as it flooded through the continent, prices rose steadily for decade after decade, a slow tide historians call the price revolution. Spain, the very kingdom into which the treasure poured, watched its industries wither, while the silver itself flowed onwards through trade, much of it ultimately traveling all the way to China, which valued silver highly and absorbed it in exchange for silks and porcelain. For the first time, a single web of exchange truly girdled the earth. A coin minted from Andean silver could end its travels in a merchant's chest in Canton. The route it traveled tells the story of the first global economy in a single image. From 1565, Spanish ships known as the Manila galleons sailed each year across the Pacific, from Acapulco in Mexico to Manila in the Philippines, laden with American silver, and returned with Chinese silks, porcelain, and spices. For 2.5 centuries, this yearly rhythm continued, the longest-running shipping route of the age, a silver thread stitched across the widest ocean on Earth. The Spanish silver coin it carried, the famous piece of 8, became so trusted and so widespread that it served as an unofficial world currency, accepted in ports on every continent, and its influence lingered long after Spain's power faded. When the young United States created its own money, it modeled the dollar on the Spanish coin that everyone already knew. All those ships, and all that treasure, sailed through storm and war and piracy, and so alongside global trade grew another quiet invention for taming the future: insurance. Merchants had long shared the risks of the sea in informal ways, but now the practice matured into contracts, premiums, and underwriters. Men who wrote their names under a ship's details in exchange for a fee, promising to bear a share of the loss if she failed to come home. In the coffee houses of a rising London, most famously the one kept by Edward Lloyd, ship owners, captains, and underwriters gathered to share news and spread risk. And from that room of coffee, ink, and gossip grew one of the most enduring institutions of world commerce. Insurance is one of money's gentlest ideas when you hold it up to the light. Many hands, each carrying a small share of a burden, so that no single family is destroyed when the storm chooses their ship. But the deepest financial revolution of the age happened somewhere small, damp, and windswept. The Netherlands. In the 17th century, this modest republic of sailors, engineers, and merchants became the richest society in the world per head, and it did so largely by inventing new ways to organize money itself. In 1602, Dutch merchants founded the United East India Company, the VOC, to trade to Asia, and they structured it in a new way, raising capital from hundreds of investors, large and small, who each owned transferable shares in the enterprise. It became the model for the Joint Stock Corporation, a business designed to outlive its founders, pooling the savings of many to attempt what no individual could. And because those shares could be bought and sold, a market in them promptly appeared. In Amsterdam, trading in VOC shares gave rise to the world's first true stock exchange, with brokers, speculators, and, before long, every technique of optimism and pessimism the modern trading floor would recognize. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, gave merchants secure accounts and reliable transfers, and the city became the humming financial heart of the Western world. Wealth in Amsterdam did not look like a king's treasure chamber. It looked like warehouses, canals, ledgers, insurance contracts, and tidy brick houses, the wealth of process rather than plunder. The Dutch also gifted the world a famous cautionary tale. In the 1630s, the prices of rare tulip bulbs, a fashionable luxury, rose to extraordinary heights, some individual bulbs changing hands for the price of a fine house, before collapsing abruptly in 1637. Modern historians debate how widespread the damage truly was, but tulip mania endures as a parable because it captures something everyone can feel. When money chases a story rather than a thing, prices can float free of the ground, for a while, like a lantern rising on its own hot air, lovely and doomed. Let the harbor rock you gently now, rigging creaks. water laps against oak. In the warehouses sleep pepper, silk, saltpeter, and porcelain. And in the ledgers sleep their values, neatly inked. The world is connected now, for better and for worse. And in the north of England, in a century's time, something is about to begin turning and steaming and changing everything. For almost the whole of human history, the wealth of the world grew so slowly that within a single lifetime, it barely seemed to grow at all. A peasant in the year 1700 lived, worked, and ate much as a peasant in the year 1100 had done. Then, in Britain, in the late 18th century, the long stillness broke. It began with cotton, coal, and iron, machines for spinning thread, driven first by falling water and then by James Watt's improved steam engines, could do the work of hundreds of hands. Factories rose beside the rivers of Lancashire, and then beside the coalfields, and villages became towns, and towns became smoking cities. For the first time on any large scale, ordinary people worked for wages in organized workplaces. Their labor measured not by the season, but by the clock. The early decades were often harsh, with long hours, child labor, and crowded slums, and the age's own writers, none more vividly than Charles Dickens, made sure their readers could not look away. Yet across the generations, the machine age did something no previous era had ever achieved. It made sustained growth normal. Decade after decade, the total wealth of industrial societies climbed, and slowly, unevenly, with many struggles along the way, wages, health, and possibilities climbed with it. Money changed its shape to match. Railways, mills, and ironworks needed capital in quantities no single fortune could supply. So the joint stock company, that Dutch invention, came into its own, gathering the savings of thousands of investors. Banks spread from the great cities into market towns, and ordinary families, for the first time in meaningful numbers, began to save in savings banks, building societies, and friendly societies, small regular deposits standing between a working household and disaster. Capitalism, as the new order came to be called, was not only mills and millionaires. It was also the quiet ledger of a savings book, the idea that tomorrow could be provided for today. Nothing captured the age's new relationship with money like the railways. When the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened in 1830, the first line linking two great cities with scheduled steam services, people came simply to stare, and within a generation, iron rails were spreading across Britain and then across the world, stitched together by armies of navvies with picks and barrows. Railways devoured capital on a scale no venture in history had ever required, and the public, watching early lines pay handsome dividends, rushed to supply it. In the 1840s, Britain experienced railway mania, one of the great investment frenzies of all time, when middle-class families, clergymen, widows, and shopkeepers poured their savings into hundreds of proposed lines, some visionary, some hopeless, some barely more than a name and a map. Parliament approved thousands of miles of new railway at the mania's height, and when the fever broke, fortunes vanished and lessons were learned and, in the way of these things, eventually forgotten again. Yet when the dust settled, Britain possessed the finest railway network on earth, built substantially out of a bubble. Speculation, for all its dangers, had laid real iron across real hills, and this too is part of money's strange story. Even its fevers sometimes leave gifts behind. Into this accelerating world stepped a family whose story has become one of the most famous in the history of finance, and it deserves to be told plainly and factually, for the truth is remarkable enough. Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born in 1744 in the Judengasse, the cramped Jewish quarter of Frankfurt, and built a business there as a dealer in coins, antiques, and banking services, becoming a trusted financial agent of a German prince. He had 5 sons, and in a strategy of quiet genius, he settled them in 5 cities. Amschel remained in Frankfurt, Salomon went to Vienna, Nathan to London, Karl to Naples, and James to Paris. 5 brothers, 5 branches, 1 family, bound by constant correspondence, couriers, and absolute mutual loyalty. In an age when news traveled at the speed of a horse or a sailing packet, the Rothschilds' private information network was famously swift, and their London house, under the formidable Nathan Mayer Rothschild, rose to prominence during the Napoleonic Wars, when it helped the British government move gold to pay Wellington's armies in Spain and subsidize Britain's allies, an immense logistical feat threaded through wartime Europe. After the wars, the brothers became the leading force in the growing market for government bonds, loans raised from the investing public by states, and by the middle of the 19th century, the family stood at the summit of European finance, lending to governments, financing railways, and pioneering the smooth movement of capital across borders. Around such visible success, myths and conspiracy theories multiplied, many of them fueled by anti-Semitism, and they have echoed down the years. The sober historical record needs no embellishment. The Rothschilds were bankers of extraordinary skill, operating openly in the bond markets of their era, and their real story, of information, coordination, and trust, maintained across a continent, tells us far more about how modern finance works than any legend could. By the century's end, the industrial world ran on a bloodstream of wages, savings, shares, and bonds. Money was no longer merely a way of settling yesterday's exchanges. It had become the way societies gathered their hopes and pointed them at the future. Rest with that image a moment. A gaslit street in the evening. A clerk walking home with his wages in his pocket, past a bank whose marble face is designed to say one word: safe. Inside, the ledgers are closed for the night, and in the great capitals, a new kind of institution is learning, slowly, and sometimes clumsily, to stand behind all the others. Behind every currency, there eventually arises a question that sounds simple and is not. Who takes care of money itself? Who ensures there is enough of it, but not too much? And who stands ready on the terrible day when everyone wants their money back at once? The modern answer began, as so much modern finance did, with a war. In 1694, the government of England, needing funds to fight France, chartered a new institution, the Bank of England. A group of investors lent the government a large sum, and in return, received the right to operate as a bank and issue notes. Over the following 2 centuries, the bank on Threadneedle Street, affectionately nicknamed the Old Lady, evolved from a private company serving the state into something new in the world: a central bank, the bank of the government, the bank of the other banks, and the guardian of the currency itself. Its notes became the trusted paper of the realm, and each still carries the old inscription, a fossil of monetary history, promising to pay the bearer on demand the sum written on its face, words from the days when the paper was a claim on gold. Other nations followed in their own time, and the United States, after long suspicion of concentrated financial power and after repeated banking panics, established its own central bank, the Federal Reserve, in 1913. Central banks took on the duties that now quietly shape every economic life on Earth. They set the base rate of interest, the price of borrowing money, lowering it to encourage spending and investment when times are slack, raising it to cool things down when prices rise too fast. And in a crisis, they act as the lender of last resort, standing behind solvent banks caught in a storm. Because financial panic is a kind of fire that spreads through belief, and someone must be able to say, credibly, there is enough, you need not run. Through the 19th century, this whole edifice rested on a single gleaming foundation: gold. Britain led the way onto a formal gold standard in the early 19th century, defining the pound as a fixed weight of gold, and by the 1870s most major economies had joined. Every major currency was a fixed quantity of gold under another name. which meant every currency stood in fixed relation to every other. Trade and investment flowed across borders with remarkable confidence. A contract in pounds, francs, or marks was, underneath, a contract in the same universal metal, and the decades before 1914 became the first great age of globalization. It is worth pausing to ask a question children ask, and adults forget to. Why gold? Out of all the substances on Earth, why did this one soft yellow metal become the throne of value in so many unconnected civilizations? The answer is written partly in chemistry. Gold does not rust, tarnish, or decay. A coin lifted from a shipwreck after 4 centuries in the sea comes up shining as if minted yesterday. It is rare enough to be precious, but not so rare that it cannot circulate. It can be divided, melted, and recombined endlessly, without losing anything, and it is beautiful, which matters more than economists like to admit. Iron rusts, silver blackens, grain rots, cattle age, but gold simply endures, and human beings, who do not endure, have always been moved by things that do. In Victorian Britain, the gold standard had a face and a weight you could hold. The gold sovereign, a small heavy coin bearing St. George and the Dragon, minted in the hundreds of millions and trusted from Melbourne to Montreal. And in the vaults of the great central banks, gold performed its quietest work of all. When nations settled their accounts with one another, bars were sometimes not even shipped across the sea, but simply wheeled from one country's pile to another's within the same vault, a few yards of movement recording the tides of world trade. The gold rarely saw daylight. Like the silver of ancient Babylon sleeping in its temple, it ruled the world's prices while lying perfectly still in the dark. The gold standard offered discipline and stability, and it exacted a price for them. Because money was chained to gold, governments could not create more of it in an emergency. And when crises came, the chain could bite deep, forcing wages and prices downward with real human pain. The First World War shattered the system, as the belligerents suspended gold and printed money for survival. Attempts to restore the old order between the wars ended badly, and in the depths of the Great Depression, country after country let go of gold in order to fight for recovery. In 1944, with the Second World War still raging, delegates from 44 nations met at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire to design a gentler successor. Currencies were fixed to the American dollar, and the dollar alone was fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. For a generation, that arrangement anchored the rebuilding of the world. It could not last forever. Dollars accumulated abroad far beyond America's gold, and the promise grew strained. On the 15th of August 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. The last link quietly parted, and for the first time in thousands of years, no major money on earth was tied to a precious metal at all. Hold the image of a gold bar in the vaults for a moment, deep beneath the streets, in the cool and the dark. Gold no longer stands beneath our money, and yet nothing crashed to the ground, because the true foundation had never really been the metal. It had always been the agreement. Breathe slowly and let us drift onward into the strange, weightless money of the modern world. The money in your pocket tonight and the numbers resting in your bank account are what economists call fiat currency, from the Latin word meaning, let it be done. Fiat money is money because a government declares it so, accepts it for taxes, and manages its supply, and because, far more importantly, everyone around you agrees to treat it as valuable. There is no vault of gold behind it. There is something both stranger and stronger. There is confidence, woven from law, habit, and the settled expectation that the note accepted today can be spent tomorrow. It sounds fragile when said aloud, and history honestly records the rare places where the weave has failed, where governments created money far faster than their economies created goods, and prices spiraled beyond reason. The most famous of these episodes unfolded in Germany in 1923, when the young Weimar Republic, crushed by war debts and reparations, ran its printing presses until the mark dissolved into absurdity. Photographs from that autumn show children building castles from bricks of worthless banknotes, and stories tell of workers paid twice a day and rushing out at lunchtime to spend the morning's wages before evening made them worth less still, of prices in cafes rising while a cup of coffee was being drunk. It was a trauma that entered a nation's memory and never fully left it. And it stands in the story of money as the Roman denarius stands, a reminder, gently repeated across the centuries, that trust is the whole of the structure, and that trust, once burned, takes generations to regrow. Yet the quieter truth is how well the system has served, day in and day out, across most of the world. Central banks aim to keep money stable, typically seeking inflation that is low, slow, and predictable, and whole generations now have lived, saved, and grown old inside currencies made of nothing but managed trust. It is, when you pause to feel it, one of the largest acts of continuous cooperation our species has ever performed. Billions of strangers, every day, agreeing. While money's foundation was changing, its texture was changing too. In February 1950 in New York, a businessman named Frank McNamara, together with his partners, launched a small cardboard card called the Diners Club card, which allowed members to dine at participating restaurants and settle everything with a single monthly bill. The story told ever afterwards is that the idea was born when McNamara found himself at dinner without his wallet. Within a few years, the card had spread to hotels and shops and crossed oceans, and in 1958 came American Express and Bank Americard, the bank-issued card that would eventually grow into Visa. The credit card folded an ancient practice, buying on trust, into a modern convenience, and it changed the psychology of spending. Money no longer needed to be present to be spent, it only needed to be promised. Then the numbers themselves began to move. From the 1960s and 1970s onwards, banks connected their ledgers through computers, and money became, in its ordinary daily life, information. Cash machines appeared on high street walls, dispensing notes at midnight. Wages arrived as transfers rather than pay packets. With the internet came online banking. With the smartphone came the bank in your pocket. And with contactless payment came the strange, softly futuristic ritual we now perform without thinking, resting a card or a phone or a watch against a reader for half a second, a chime, a nod. Done. In some countries, cash itself has become a rarity, and a child growing up today may see money mainly as a number that lives behind glass, changing when tapped. And here the story takes a turn that would have delighted the merchants of the Silk Road. Some of the boldest leaps in the history of digital money have come not from the old financial capitals, but from places the banking system had largely passed by. Across parts of Africa and Asia in the early 21st century, hundreds of millions of people who had never held a bank account began sending, saving, and receiving money through simple mobile phones, value moving as text, across the airwaves, market traders and farming families managing their affairs through a device in the palm of the hand. A grandmother in a village could receive her son's wages from the city in moments, safely, without a bank branch for 100 miles. It was flying money reborn, the Tang dynasty's insight returning after 12 centuries in a new dress, and it stands as a gentle reminder that the story of money has never really belonged to the powerful alone. It belongs to anyone, anywhere, who needs to send help home. Underneath the convenience, it is worth noticing what has actually happened, because it is quietly extraordinary. Your money, today, consists of entries in databases, promises recorded in patterns of electricity, guarded by encryption and law and institutional habit. The clay tablet has become a server, the temple granary has become a data center, humming in the dark, cooled by fans, holding the harvests of the world as light. The form has changed beyond all recognition. The substance, a promise carefully recorded, has not changed at all in 5,000 years. In the autumn of 2008, with the world's banking system shuddering through its worst crisis in generations, a short technical paper appeared quietly on the internet. Its author used the name Satoshi Nakamoto, and to this day, no one knows for certain who that is. The paper proposed a system called Bitcoin, a form of electronic cash that could pass directly from person to person, anywhere on Earth, without any bank, company, or government standing in the middle. In January 2009, the system came alive, and a new chapter in the long story of money began to write itself. The invention at Bitcoin's heart is called the blockchain, and the idea, stripped of its engineering, is beautifully simple and very old. It is a ledger, a single shared book of accounts, copied across thousands of computers around the world, to which new pages, called blocks, are added in a slow and public rhythm, each page cryptographically sealed to the one before, so that the record stretches back in an unbroken chain. Because everyone holds the book, no one can quietly rewrite it. The system replaces the trusted banker with mathematics and openness, a temple ledger with no temple, and it was designed with a fixed limit. Only 21 million bitcoins can ever exist, a scarcity written into the code itself, in deliberate contrast to money that can be created at will. New bitcoins enter the world through a process its creator called mining, a word chosen with a historian's ear, deliberately echoing the silver of Potosi and the gold of the Klondike. But this mining involves no picks and no mountains. Around the world, computers race to solve immense mathematical puzzles, and the winner earns the right to add the next page to the shared ledger, receiving newly created coins as a reward. The puzzles serve no purpose except to be difficult, and that difficulty is the point, for it makes rewriting the ledger's history so expensive that honesty becomes cheaper than fraud. Where the old system asked you to trust the character of the banker, this one asks you to trust the arithmetic of the network, and the reward for adding each page falls by half every few years, so that the flow of new coins slows like a tide going out, until one distant day it stops altogether. In the beginning, of course, none of it was worth anything at all, because value, as this whole night has whispered, is agreement, and at first no one had agreed. The early enthusiasts traded coins among themselves as curiosities, and the moment the agreement first became visible has passed into folklore. In May 2010, a programmer in Florida offered 10,000 bitcoins to anyone who would order him 2 pizzas, and someone did. It is remembered fondly every year as Bitcoin Pizza Day, partly as a joke about what those coins would later be worth, but it deserves remembering for a deeper reason. That evening, for the first time, this new money bought bread, which is the oldest test there is. Every currency in tonight's story, from Mesopotamian silver to the pound in your purse, became real on the day it could be exchanged for dinner. In the years since, cryptocurrency has grown from an experiment among enthusiasts into a global phenomenon, and thousands of other digital currencies have followed. Some serious attempts to improve the idea, some fashions that bloomed and faded like tulips. Honest observers acknowledge both its light and its shadows. Its admirers point to genuine achievements, money that can cross borders in minutes, savings that no failing government can quietly inflate away, financial access for people the banking system has ignored, and the simple, principled appeal of a currency that belongs to no state. Its critics point to real and serious concerns, prices that swing violently enough to ruin the unlucky, waves of fraud and speculation, the energy consumed by some networks, and its usefulness to those who prefer their transactions unseen. Governments and central banks, meanwhile, have responded in the way established powers have always responded to monetary invention, first with dismissal, then with concern, and finally with imitation. Many now study or pilot digital currencies of their own, official money issued directly by the central bank in electronic form, combining the convenience of the new technology with the backing of the state. Whether such currencies spread widely, and on what terms, remains an open question, and it is a question about far more than engineering, for money issued as pure information raises gentle but serious matters that societies will need to talk through patiently, about privacy, about how visible our ordinary lives should be, and about keeping a place in the system for those who still live by cash. These conversations have, in truth, only just begun, and they will likely continue through much of your lifetime, unfolding slowly, the way all the great monetary changes in tonight's story unfolded, not overnight, but across generations. What no one disputes is the question Bitcoin has forced into the open, the oldest question in tonight's whole story, asked now with new urgency. What is money, and who should we trust to keep it? And that question leads inward, to the most intimate territory of all, the place where money truly lives, which is not the vault or the server, but the human mind. Psychologists and behavioral economists have spent decades mapping our relationship with money, and their findings are gentle, humbling things to hold at the end of a day. We feel the pain of losing money roughly twice as keenly as the pleasure of gaining the same amount, which is why worry so often outweighs contentment. Beyond the point where our genuine needs are met, additional wealth adds surprisingly little lasting happiness, because we adapt to what we have with remarkable speed, and quietly raise our sights. We measure ourselves not against our needs but against our neighbors, which is why status can make wealthy people feel poor. Scarcity, even remembered scarcity from childhood, can shape a lifetime of habits, and in one of the most consistent findings in the whole field, money spent on others, given, shared, used to warm someone else's life, reliably brings more happiness than money spent on ourselves. Beneath all these findings runs one deep current, and it flows directly through the hour you are resting in now. For the human mind, money is rarely really about the numbers. It is about safety. The feeling of enough is one of the oldest feelings we have, older than money, older than language, the settled ease of the granary that will last the winter, and its absence is one of the oldest fears. That is why money worries have a particular talent for arriving at night, when the lights are off and the mind, with nothing before it, turns to guarding the future. If such thoughts have ever kept you awake, you are in the company of essentially everyone who has ever lived. Babylonian tablets record the anxieties of debtors. Roman writers complain of lying awake over their accounts. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the wealthiest men alive in his day, reminded himself in his private notebook that very little is needed for a happy life. The worry is ancient, and so is the remedy the wise have always suggested, which is to remember, deliberately and often, the difference between what is urgent and what is real. Tonight, nothing is urgent. The accounts, whatever they hold, will hold the same until morning, and worrying over them in the dark has never yet changed a single figure. You are allowed to set the ledger down, which means the science has circled all the way back to the campfire where we began. The hunter, giving away the surplus of the hunt, was not being irrational. He was investing in the only bank that has never failed, the goodwill of other human beings. Generosity, it turns out, was always the soundest currency. Let that settle over you like a warm blanket. Whatever tomorrow's balance may say, tonight you are safe, you are resting, and the oldest wealth of all, connection, costs nothing at all. We are near the end of our journey now, and you may already be more asleep than awake. That is perfectly fine. Let the last of the story wash over you like slow water. Consider, one final time, how the meaning of wealth has changed as we traveled. In ancient Egypt, wealth was grain, the fullness of the granary against the hungry season. And the greatest wealth of all was time beyond death, which is why pharaohs poured the surplus of a whole kingdom into tombs meant to last forever. In Greece, wealth was land, olive trees and standing in the assembly, and a rich man proved his riches not by keeping them, but by spending them publicly, funding a warship or a festival chorus, buying honor with silver. In Rome, wealth wore its togas openly, counted in estates, grain ships, and the long morning queues of clients at a great man's door. And yet the philosophers Rome most admired kept insisting, from their comfortable villas, that the only true wealth was a quiet mind. The medieval world measured riches in acres and oaths, and taught, in every church, that a camel would pass through a needle's eye more easily than a rich man into heaven, even as its abbeys and cathedral treasuries filled with gold. Renaissance Florence made wealth clever, spinning it out of exchange rates and ledgers, and then made it beautiful, spending it on domes and frescoes. Victorian Britain made wealth respectable, a matter of industry, thrift and compound interest, the railway share and the savings book, prosperity as a moral report card. And modern society has made wealth abstract and, in some ways more private than ever, numbers behind glass, invisible in a crowd, so that the richest person on a street may be impossible to identify by sight, something no other age could have imagined. In the medieval world, it was loyalty and acres, oaths running up and down the great pyramid of obligation. In Renaissance Florence, wealth learned to live in ledgers and discovered patronage, turning profit into beauty. In Victorian Britain, it became industry and thrift, mills and railway shares, and the savings book in the drawer. And in our own time, wealth has become almost pure abstraction, light in glass fibers, numbers in the dark. And yet it still buys the same ancient things it always bought: bread, shelter, safety, possibility, and time. Especially time. Perhaps that is the quietest definition of wealth there has ever been. Enough security to rest without fear, exactly as you are resting now. And the story is not finished. Money is changing again, even as you drift. Central banks are exploring digital currencies of their own. Engineers speak of tokenization, of ownership in all its forms, recorded on shared digital ledgers, and moving as easily as messages. Artificial intelligence is already threading itself through the world of finance, watching for fraud, steering investments, and perhaps, in time, machines will settle accounts with other machines, in transactions no human ever sees. If that comes to pass, it will be worth smiling at quietly, for it would mean the ledger, born in a Sumerian temple, had finally learned to keep itself. Some societies may set aside physical cash altogether, and thoughtful people will keep asking careful questions as they do, about privacy, about those left behind, about how much of our shared life should be visible to any single authority. Others wonder what money might become in stranger futures still, whether communities might one day keep value in forms we have not imagined, just as no Sumerian scribe, pressing reed into clay, could have imagined a contactless card. If tonight has shown anything, it is that money has never once finished changing, and that every generation believes, wrongly, that its own form of money is the final one. The Lydians surely thought so of the coin, the song officials of their printed notes, the Victorians of their gold sovereigns. We think so of our glowing screens. Someone, centuries from now, will look back on our tapping and chiming with the same fond curiosity we feel for cowrie shells. None of this is certain. The future of money never has been. The only safe prediction is the one this whole night has taught us. Whatever form money takes next, it will still be, underneath everything, what it was beside the first campfire. A way for human beings to trust one another at a distance. So let the whole journey settle now, softly, like dust in evening light, the shells and the spades of bronze, the lion of Lydia, the denarius, bright and then fading, camel bells on the long road, the fares of champagne, ink drying in a Florentine ledger, silver galleons on a dark sea, the steam and glow of the mills, the old lady of Threadneedle Street, a cardboard card on a restaurant table, a chime as a phone touches glass. 5,000 years, and every step of it made of the same invisible material. Trust, given form. Cooperation, made durable. Millions of strangers agreeing so that each of us can live. Money was never really the coins, or the paper, or the numbers. It was always us. Thank you, truly, for spending this evening with Sleep into Power. Nights like this one are only possible because of this community, and I never take your company for granted. If you have enjoyed tonight's documentary and you would like to hear more like it, please do subscribe and leave a comment letting me know which subject you would love to drift away to next. Because so many of our best documentaries, including this one, began as a suggestion in the comments. And if you have any thoughts on how these documentaries could be even better, longer, deeper, gentler, I read your suggestions carefully, because the goal here is a simple one: to build the largest and most trusted sleep documentary channel in the world, one peaceful night at a time. If you would like to support the channel further, the Sleep into Power book is available on Amazon in paperback and Kindle, and these documentaries are also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts whenever you prefer to simply listen. You can also help fund future documentaries through Buy Me a Coffee. All of the links are waiting quietly in the video description below for the morning. But for now, there is nothing left to do and nowhere left to be. The granaries are full, the ledgers are balanced, the caravan has reached the caravanserai, and the fires are burning low. Let your breathing be slow and deep and easy. You are safe, you are warm, and you are wealthy in the oldest way there is. Sleep into power, guys. Good night.